2009. The object that would come to mean so much for our family began with a grocery line and a restless toddler. Someone pulled a soft, patched hat from a bag, patterned like a dinosaur, threadbare in places, already bearing the affectionate repairs of repeated use, and handed it forward. It was practical and ridiculous at once. No heirloom, no ceremony, only a small thing that made a child grin and adults relax. From that low origin, the hat migrated through ordinary life. At every family gathering a new child would appear and, as if by tradition, the hat would be produced. It was an invitation to play, a sanctioned moment of levity that allowed adults to step aside for a little while and let children be childish. That simple, recurring joke would later prove useful beyond the playroom. It would become a modest civic device. January 2011. The winter that year carried a particular kind of cold, the sort that makes conversation short and clothes rustle like private letters. It was on a cold afternoon in January that I first saw, with a clarity that returned years later, what happens to belonging when the frames of a house shift. My mother had moved into a small assisted living residence on the edge of town. The decision was not a single dramatic moment but the culmination of a year in which stairs had become propositions and routines required reminders. Our lives, work, children, obligations, had become a precarious balancing act. We approached the move with both relief and apology, relief for structure and safety, apology for changing something called family. The months that followed, January through March of 2011, were awkward, full of tiny missteps that felt at the time like indictments. Medication instructions were misread, staples were misplaced, arguments flared over where botanical prints ought to hang. Every ordinary logistical friction seemed freighted with meaning. A missed cue became evidence of decline, a forgotten name proof of loss. These first awkward months taught a compact lesson about belonging. It is not enacted by proclamation but assembled through repeated quiet acts. Those acts began to accumulate. A neighbor brought pies from Sunday baking. A morning nurse hummed the same melody my mother had hummed for years. A care aide tucked a faded floral cushion at the precise angle my mother preferred. The edges of what we called home folded outward into new rooms, routines, and people. Belonging proved not to be a static property of a single house but a sequence of small convergences, arrivals and departures, the folding of a napkin, the placing of a cushion, that stitched one day to the next. March 2012. Over the next year, we experimented with ways to anchor our altered family geography. At a family meal in March 2012, as conversation drifted into the ballast of middle-aged topics, someone, maybe my brother, maybe Renata, proposed an idea that felt both ridiculous and urgent, an intentionally modest little repast. The word appealed to my mother. She liked ritual without spectacle, a way to mark time that required attention but not production. We set 3 simple rules. We would choose a fixed window in the mellow days after New Year's, early January, so seasonal exhaustion might dissolve into presence. Each person would bring exactly 1 dish or a comparable small offering. No one person would bear the entire logistical load. The constraint became the point. Limiting responsibility made generosity possible and sustainable. January 2013. The first little repast, held on the second Sunday in January as agreed, felt like a small experiment that unexpectedly worked. My mother lit candles because she liked the low glow that warmed hands and faces and made conversation more patient. My brother took charge of timing like a modest choreographer. Never early, never late. The children, still messy with domestic invention in those days, folded paper boats and floated them in a shallow wooden tray between courses. Their interlude provided breathing room between small talk and the more charged subjects family tables eventually pressed toward. A neighbor confessed she had learned to make pastry, another produced an old mixtape, taped in the pre-digital sense, of saxophone ballads my mother used to hum. The repast became a container for gentleness and improvisation, generosity calibrated against capacity, gathered without spectacle. Spring 2013. As the repast took shape, other practical and emotional rearrangements accumulated. Around that spring my mother began to say more often, "A little help." That phrase, small, literal, almost shy, shaped what followed. My brother, whose impatience could be both exasperating and tender, adopted a pragmatic line: "We'll manage the things we can manage." Renata proposed a monthly check-in list for medications and appointments. Marta began bringing a casserole on the first Saturday of every month, whether asked or not. These interventions were uneven, awkward sometimes and luminous at others, but they taught the slow art of reliable care. Summer 2013. By the summer of 2013, my mother needed an apartment with fewer stairs and better light. We measured door frames and hallway widths carefully, choosing a unit with a view of birches. She planted a small fern in the window. I built a bookshelf to her exacting specifications. It should face the window, she insisted, and arranged worn novels like a miniature landscape. The dinosaur hat found a peg by the entry where anyone could take it. The move forced ritual redistribution. The repast adapted to a smaller kitchen and an old butcher block. My brother assumed more logistics. Renata curated playlists of saxophones, and Marta mastered freezing shepherd's pie without robbing it of soul. We discovered that loss and continuity could coexist. A silver tray could be both an heirloom and a utensil. A slipped photograph tucked into a cookbook could feel like visitation. Autumn 2014. The hat, by then a household joke, started to function outside family gatherings. In the fall of 2014, during a town hall meeting where voices hardened and territory mapped itself in sharp edges, I put the hat on and read aloud, in a deliberately solemn voice, a child's note from the lost and found. Laughter broke the tension and softened hardened positions. The hat did not settle policy disagreements, but it opened a narrow door through which attention could re-enter civic conversation. Absurdity became a bridge, humor a kind of civic lubricant. Fall 2014. Around the same season, we began to accept professional help in the house. We hired a home health aide who arrived in pressed scrubs, carrying a thermos labeled with her name and a blunt compassion that cut through sentiment. She explained plainly what was reasonable to expect from her and from us, who would cook, who would drive to appointments, which chores were matters of dignity and which of safety. There were boundary tests and mistakes, overstepped assumptions and botched conversations. But over time, naming what we needed and could not do became a form of civic housekeeping, the boring, humane infrastructure that sustains life. Late 2014. It felt right to carry the hat into other corners of life. When a cousin called in late 2014 to say one of the 5 children, those 5 who had threaded through our stories since that first fraught holiday, had graduated from community college and wanted a modest celebratory dinner, I bought a ticket. I wore the dinosaur hat on the plane, partly out of mischief and partly as a talisman of family absurdities. A man in the aisle called it glorious. At the dinner, the graduate, now lanky and pulling upright from childhood, described stocking shelves at a grocery store and a woman named Lila who baked sourdough on Sundays. He reached across the table and touched my hand as if to test the reality of attention. In that moment, presence became a set of registers: literal presence at a table, mediated presence in calls and texts, practical presence in recipes and small gifts. I began to follow a lodestar principle: show up where your presence amplifies care and decline where it diminishes it. 2014 mistakes. We did not manage everything well. I missed an important call in 2014 that would have changed a plan. I misread an instruction and arrived late for a test. Those errors humbled me and forced changes: more rigorous calendars, double-check notes, asking for help with logistics that once seemed trivial. The learning curve was practical and brisk. 2015. The little repast matured. By 2015, parents from neighboring blocks began to attend. A teacher from the local school came with news of a student who had stopped doodling on her desk and started sketching birds instead. The repast never insulated itself from the larger world. It became a place where we practiced steadiness in receiving the world. That January, a blizzard, December 2015, had grounded flights and left me sleeping on a friend's sofa with the hat folded beside my bag, reminded me that travel and home were entangled. The next morning the world was brittle and bright, and each trip I took thereafter reconfigured what I returned to, sometimes to repair what had frayed, sometimes to weave new threads. Spring 2016. Across the early 2010s, my relationship to travel shifted from escape to orientation. I traveled for work and residencies, but with more intention, fewer spur-of-the-moment departures, more planned windows of absence. A residency in New Mexico in the spring of 2016 worked like a patient teacher. The desert's acute light and blunt horizon sharpened perspective. I returned carrying small tokens: a postcard, a bar of soap I thought might please my mother, that were not apologies but evidence of intentional distance crossed. November 2016. A funeral in Maine that November required a cross-country flight and sitting in a chapel where the sky seemed unusually sharp. Grief clarified priorities: who would attend, who would hold space, who would return quickly. The hat traveled with me, sometimes as comfort and sometimes as a small prop to ease tense moments. January 26, 2017. The repast endured weather and stubbornness. On January 26, 2017, snow pressed against windows and turned the world into a flat sheet of white. Someone suggested postponing the repast. My mother, stubborn in a way that felt like moral will, insisted, "We will eat." We did. The house hummed with hot plates passed between hands, radio songs, the smell of onion and thyme braided with clean, cold air. February 2018. One evening at a repast taught with unsaid things, a young neighbor whose father had recently died asked why the hat was always on our table. The question struck the seam where small rituals met the larger business of grief. I thought of the hat's many roles: toy, diplomatic device, absurdity that invited gentleness. "It isn't really about the hat," I said. "It's about making room." She nodded as if given a recipe she had not known she needed. A child placed the hat on his head and demanded we pledge to eat our vegetables. Laughter thawed the grief for a few beats. 2018 zoning meeting. The hat continued to be useful in civic settings. During a heated zoning meeting that year, I donned it and read something intentionally silly from a child's notebook. Laughter followed and allowed people to remember the stakes of human relations are also about preserving the capacity to speak to one another afterward. The hat did not trivialize issues, it changed their tone and kept negotiation possible. Late 2010s domestic rhythm. The decade's middle years brought an accrual of particulars. Medication schedules grew complicated enough to justify a monthly color-coded chart. Specialists demanded blood work, scans, consultations. Appointments proliferated and sentences in my mother's voice shortened. My brother, a man of practical fixes, found it harder to sit with repetition. We learned to hold a patient center without softening into resignation. We navigated living wills, power of attorney conversations, the bitter negotiations of insurance. There were ugly arguments, bitter, exhausting disputes over authority, and nights when everyone was irritable and the dishwasher's constant hum felt accusatory. The discipline of humility, saying "I failed there, I'm sorry," became as crucial as any casserole or playlist. Professional help sharpened boundaries and made them livable. Visiting nurses advised on wound care. Social workers navigated insurance forms with tempered, weary competence. These forms of expertise, unfamiliar at first, became essential. We built infrastructure, morning pills arrayed on the counter, appointments inked on a shared calendar, a labeled folder of important numbers. These banal practices became scaffolding on which life leaned. Digital tools rose to prominence. Shared calendars, text chains, and a simple spreadsheet of medications, boringly heroic tools, prevented crises like a good fence prevents wandering. In an era of smartphones, these small digital practices became as essential as a well-stocked medicine cabinet. Children growing. Watching the 5 children who had threaded through our lives over the decade was a slow, accruing pleasure. 1, bossy as a child and later the careful mapper of streets and neighbors, mailed a photograph of a hand-drawn map of our block with benches marked like treasure. Another, once furtive, sent a video fixing a bicycle chain and joked about adulthood rewarding practical knowledge. One wanted recipes shipped in small Ziploc bags, another wanted the hat passed at just the right dramatic moment. Affection proved elastic, it stretched and returned when tethered by periodic, dependable contact. Saying no. Saying no became as important as saying yes. At first refusal felt like failure, by mid-decade it became an ethical clarity. "I can come for New Year's, but not the whole week," was a sentence I learned to hold. Honesty about capacity proved generous, it made me predictable and therefore dependable. This linguistic shift turned finite capacity into a resource to manage instead of a moral deficit to disguise. Mistakes taught better systems. Missing a call in 2014, arriving late for a test, or misreading instructions forced stricter calendars and double checks. Shared systems, spreadsheets, calendars, text threads, grew less like convenience and more like lifebuoy. These practices prevented small failures from cascading into crises. Domestic moments and small rituals accumulated weight. On ordinary Tuesdays my mother baked pies because crust was geometry she trusted. A child negotiated exact numbers of marshmallows for hot chocolate and won. A silver spoon passed hand to hand as both relic and utensil. These quotidian acts, minor, repeated kindnesses, felt heavier than public declarations about love. They became the grammar of care. Marta's casseroles, Renata's playlists, my brother's morning lists, predictability braided into intimacy. March 2020. Then the COVID-19 pandemic arrived and rewrote rules overnight. Assisted living facilities closed their doors to visitors. Public health directives reversed the usual flow of care. For several months, the little repast could not convene in person. The dinosaur hat moved into a drawer. Phone calls and video chats became surrogate tables. Where we had once passed bread by hand, we performed the oddly formal choreography of virtual gatherings. The labeled folder of contacts, the medication spreadsheet, the shared calendar translated to screens. Renata curated playlists for Zoom. Marta learned to drop casseroles outside the door and label them with sticky notes. Neighbors adapted to socially distanced windows of conversation. The hat remained useful as a photographed signal sent across the ether, a reminder that we had not forgotten to be ridiculous. 2021 to 2022. As the world reopened in cautious steps, the repast returned, adapted but persistent. Masks and air purifiers entered the scene. We ate at staggered times and kept an extra plate for someone lingering at the doorway. The ritual had changed because the world had changed, but its persistence mattered more than exact replication. We continued to treat family objects with lightness rather than reverence. A silver spoon was both heirloom and utensil, a recipe card both manuscript and map. Mid-2020s. By the mid-2020s the 5 children were dispersed, some living in other cities, some with families of their own, crossing back into this geography at intervals. They had become less a problem to be solved than a threshold to cross again and again. They taught me that care can be arranged, that boundaries can be compassionate, and that returning can be braver than leaving. Quieter evenings increased. Obligations thinned, and I found more time to sit with small objects and memories. I would take the dinosaur hat down and hold it. Its fabric was patched, colors softened, small tooth-marked seams bore witness to infants learning the world by mouth. I never considered throwing it away. The hat was a modest ledger, gestures that began for children and eventually met adults where they were. It embodied a practice, small interventions that mattered more than I had expected. The hat persisted as a permission structure. It allowed grown people to step briefly into a softer register, amusement before honesty, levity to bridge awkwardness. Sometimes people need provision of humor before they can be honest, sometimes they need to leave before they can return. Both movements are part of belonging. Reflection across a decade. History, in the small sense I live it, is not only a sequence of dramatic moments but an accumulation of modest practices. Over the past 15 years, broader policy shifts, the expansion of assisted living options, the rise of home healthcare as a visible industry, public health interventions in 2020, provided a frame for what we did at the table. But the table itself was where we acted. The repast and the hat are small technologies for social cohesion, culinary and theatrical, deliberately undramatic. They taught us how to call people in and let them go, how to show up and step back, how to ask for help and receive it with dignity. Choices hardened and softened. I began to buy plane tickets with deliberation, tickets for graduations, modest job celebrations, hospital vigils, or to choose to stay, to make a Tuesday pie, to hold a hand while a nurse threaded and to be a steady voice with paperwork. The paradox was instructive. Sometimes the bravest trip was the decision to return and then to stay longer than planned. Practical scaffolding mattered. We filed power of attorney documents with necessary legal clarity. We completed bureaucratic forms and learned to respect their necessity without letting them define our relationships. Professional expertise, the nurse, the social worker, became indispensable. We accepted help without surrendering essential autonomy. The boring acts of care, double-checking logistics, sharing calendars, asking for help with a suitcase of appointments, carried the weight of living. I never romanticized aging. There were ugly moments and bitter conversations, nights when fear and fatigue made everyone irritable. We made mistakes, apologized, and tried again. The discipline of humility, admitting failure and making repairs, became as crucial as any recipe or playlist. Care proved as often an act of repair as celebration. People sometimes ask if I would do anything differently. I think of the missed call in 2014, the misread note, the nights of impatience. I would be kinder earlier, perhaps more explicit about what I could and could not offer. Mistakes taught us to refine systems, double-check logistics, shared calendars, asking for help when a suitcase of appointments became too heavy for one mind. These are the practical acts that sustain life. So the hat stays on its peg beside the stew recipe book. The repast continues, adapted through weather, policy shifts, and pandemic. I keep flight plans and boundaries both in my pocket. I keep the playlist ready and the recipe bookmarked. The routes between people are rarely straight. They loop, double back, and require detours. Sometimes the bravest thing is to return and then decide to stay a little longer. The hat is a compact lesson. Kindness is drafted in margin notes, in the quiet smallness of a repast, in a hand reaching across a table to test whether attention still holds. The most necessary civic work can be practiced at the scale of a kitchen, a chair, and an earnest invitation to eat. I had been telling myself for months that there would be a Christmas when I did not have to carry everything at once. There had been smaller rebellions before, an early January trip for a cousin's wedding in 2016 that I accepted as a necessary escape, a 3-day residency in 2019 to finish an essay, but those felt like intermissions inside an otherwise continuous performance. The invitation my mother extended in late October 2024 felt different in tone. "We'll have them all for Christmas," she said in a voice that was part logistic and part hope. "You can watch them while I rest." Her meaning was not hostile, it was exhausted. The phrasing, however, implied that the labor of keeping the small republic of cousins, chairs, and kitchen accoutrements together would fall to me. The calendar I kept had, by then, tightened like a cord around my wrist. There were standing obligations. Monthly check-ins with the neurologist in March, quarterly home health evaluations in June and September, the recurring lab panels in January and July, and the social scaffolding I had learned to erect when mom's sentences shortened. The spreadsheet on my phone listed medications with color codes, timestamps, and the nurse who would come at 10 a.m. on weekdays. Google Calendar pinged reminders with the tenderness of a small bell. Even so, watching 5 kids implied an intensity that would rewrite schedules, swallow available hours, and risk the fragile predictability that had become my first line of care. I said no. Not because I disliked the children. No conceivable responsibility for that could ever be true, but because I had, after 10 years of incremental erosion, learned the arithmetic of capacity. Saying yes to that particular December would mean saying no to 3 weeks of physical therapy visits already scheduled for mom in January. It would mean squeezing or canceling Renata's playlist curation sessions that helped my mother sleep. It would mean missing the paperwork appointment with our social worker that could, quite concretely, change the trajectory of care by approving more home health hours. Saying no was a risk. It could make me look uncharitable, it could start an argument. Arguments had been bitter, draining, and frequent over the last decade. But I had learned that a reliable no made me more dependable in other registers. A definitive refusal could be the hinge on which better care pivoted. My mother did not take the refusal well. In early November, she delivered her disappointment with the precision of someone who had rehearsed a complaint. "There you go, your family, abandoning the table, the hat." She called it the hat, not thinking about my private calculus of medical schedules. I blamed the pandemic for the flintiness in both of our voices. March 2020 had not only closed doors to the assisted living facilities, it had also made intimacies of obligations. Our tensions were the kind of thing that, if left unchecked, calcified. There were emails exchanged with a cousin who lived 2 states away, "Can you?" And a brother who offered to take the first week but said, with exhausted candor, that he could not do more because of his job and because repetition wore him down faster now than it once had. The choice I made in late November was to board a plane. There is a small moral choreography in that gesture. To leave at Christmas felt, on its face, like an abdication. I paid attention to the choreography precisely because the gesture could be read as so many things: refusal, protection of fragile resources, avoidance. I wanted it to be none of those, or to be purposefully one of those and honest about it. I bought a ticket on November 28, 2024, for a flight on December 19th. The destination was a coastal town where a friend, someone who had offered sanctuary during the early pandemic, had an empty cottage and the patience of a person who had once been paid to listen to others' grief. The choice of date mattered. Arriving on the 20th would let me be away for Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, two of the most fraught hours on the family calendar, and to return the week after, when the frenzy of post-holiday clutter and the practicalities of January would be manageable. I told my mother in a voice that tried to carry more than I felt. "I'll come back after New Year's," I said. "I'll be here for the rehab appointment on January 12th, and I'll stay to help with the lab on the 15th. I offered specifics because the systems we had built, shared calendars, a labeled folder of numbers, a clear appointment list, were more persuasive to the family's equilibrium than abstract reassurances. I paged through the spreadsheet and shared the entries for the visiting nurse who could cover morning doses, for the neighbor who could pick up any forgotten groceries, and for the cousin who agreed to be on call should an appointment run late. Departure day was a study in deliberate, unfeeling logistics. I packed the dinosaur hat in my carry-on, not to bring it with me to the cottage, but to give it a little time away from the peg where it had been hanging for years, a small experiment in removing sentimental weight from a domestic geography. The hat's fabric was softer than I expected, the patches arranged like a topography of small repairs. Marta had left a casserole in the freezer, labeled for emergency, and Renata had sent a playlist titled December Low Volume, with a thumbs-up emoji. I taped a sticky note to the medical binder, "Call if any med times shift, ask Nurse L." for substitution instructions. I left a printed map of the house with the location of the spare keys and the precise place where the hat was usually stored, detail that might have been unnecessary later but felt necessary then. Airport routines in December 2024 had the hybrid air of memory and novelty. Post-pandemic protocols had settled into a more relaxed choreography. Masks were common but not mandatory on all carriers. QR codes were ubiquitous for vaccination records but rarely inspected for domestic flights. There was, surprisingly, a renewed emphasis on luggage limits. The terminal hummed with people who looked like they had learned new tolerances for solitude. The seatbelt sign blinked in irregular intervals. I watched the runway mirror the sky and thought of the table at home, the chair my mother preferred, the hat. I opened my laptop and drafted a note to my mother, to be sent in the event my phone died. "I leave my phone on silent. Please call Renata if anything changes." There were predictable pangs of guilt, especially for a woman who had, for nearly 15 years, prided herself on being the dependable one. But there was also an undercurrent of clarity that the plane illuminated. Care is not simply proximity. It is, at times, the steady work of making structures that allow actual people to be present where they are most needed. If my being away for 5 days meant that Mom could have a quieter holiday, that her visiting nurses could rotate without the stress of a household wrapping itself in hypervigilance, then my absence could be generative rather than avoidant. On the flight, I read a book about the history of caregiving in the 20th century, which made me think about how families had always been the boundary lines of care and how public policy only occasionally caught up. The chapters on Medicare changes in the 1990s made me think of our own small bureaucracy. Power of attorney forms filed with a clerk in 2017, the social worker meetings in 2019 that had led to more consistent home health hours, the bitter insurance negotiations of 2015. The long arc of those administrative fights had become, in its way, an inheritance. It was not heredity in biology but in procedure, the forms, the conversations, the patience to wait on hold for an hour to speak to a nurse. I turned that history over in my mind like a coin, aware that my flight was a small movement against a much larger gravitational pull. 2 days into my escape, as rain blurred the cottage windows and the sea made a slow percussion against the shore, I called home and found my mother in good spirits. The neighbor, who had agreed to watch for any sudden needs, had checked in and reported that the children were excited about a plan to make small ornaments for a class project. My brother had taken the first week as promised and had, in a text that felt more candid than the phone call, admitted the relief he felt at being able to fail within a small margin. He had burned one casserole recipe, a mistake that would become a family joke later, and had been chastened into asking for help sooner. There had been small frictions. One of the children had cried for the hat, for the exact moment when it should be ceremonially passed at the table, but Renata, patient and practical, photographed the hat and sent the picture with a caption, "Passed digitally." The children laughed at the absurdity of a hat by picture. The ritual, somehow, held. When I returned on January 3, 2025, the house smelled like stew and orange rind. The hat hung on its peg as if it had never been packed away, a small test that had been passed. My mother's face held an expression I had not expected. Relief and a tiny, surprised gratitude that I had left it all. There were practical notes. The social worker had expanded the home health visits by 2 hours a week after seeing my careful spreadsheet. The nurse had recommended a minor adjustment in evening medication timing to reduce nocturnal agitation. The insurance company, begrudgingly, had approved a pilot coverage for a respite care provider for 1 weekend a month. Those changes, technical and bureaucratic, felt monumental. They meant that the next time a family plan required a 5-child watch, the infrastructure might be more robust. But a single plane ticket does not resolve all tensions. In the months following that holiday, conversations returned to the table. Who would host, who would travel, what traditions mattered and which could be jettisoned without losing the family's shape. We renegotiated the hat's role in the repast. It would now circulate only on certain holidays, with a child chosen by lot to hold it for 5 minutes before passing it on. That small ritual made the hat less a demand and more an agreed-upon pleasure. We formalized a holiday roster on the shared calendar, toggled permissions so that each family member could propose dates, and instituted a rule that major obligations required at least 8 weeks' notice. The roster did not eliminate resentment, but it reduced its frequency and, crucially, made resentment a shared problem rather than an individual failure. The mid-2020s taught me to measure allegiance in both presence and prearrangement. There were occasions when I flew to be present, funerals, births, graduations, and others when I flew to be absent, a paradox that felt necessary for preservation. Travel, once purely geographic, had become an instrument of care. Leaving could be a way to preserve the capacity to return. It was not always a noble calculation. I learned, slowly, to own the selfishness that comes with self-preservation and to translate it into accountable acts. Scheduling a visiting nurse before departing, leaving a list of the children's preferences taped to the refrigerator, texting Renata a playlist for quiet mornings. These were small, logistical kindnesses that maintained the social fabric even in my absence. The decade following 2025 continued to be an iterative negotiation of boundary and responsibility. We experimented with new models, a rotating respite care pool, a contract with a local childcare cooperative for holiday help, and a modest stipend pooled by several family members to hire a consistent caregiver during peak weeks. These were not perfect solutions. They shifted the problem from single-person endurance to collective resource allocation. That required money, and money, more than any recipe, tells the truth about what a family can truly ask of itself. We learned to speak about finances as a form of care. Paying a neighbor to pick up groceries was, bluntly, a moral act. Outside of our family, policy discussions about aging and care evolved slowly. In 2026, there was a municipal pilot for flexible home health hours. In 2027, the local community center launched an intergenerational program pairing teenagers with older adults for weekly visits. Small public investments that mattered at the scale of a kitchen. We advocated, we phoned, we supplied testimony about the need for more consistent respite care. None of these actions were dramatic. They were forms of civic attention that, over time, altered the availability of help. The small public becomes something you can sit at with a casserole, a playlist, and a calendar entry. I kept flying, sometimes to be present and sometimes to be away. Each flight taught me something about the thresholds of belonging. On one trip in the winter of 2028, I missed an appointment because a delayed flight landed late and I had to reschedule a lab for my mother. The error felt familiar, ancestral almost, and I did the only thing habit had taught me: apologize, restructure, and make a firm promise to check in with nurse rotation times before planning any future travel. The rhythm of failure followed by repair had become less a moral scorecard and more a family practice. We stumbled, admitted it, and tried to build better fences. The hat remained a small ledger of those attempts. Sometimes it was passed at a graduation, sometimes it was photographed and sent as a joke when someone was traveling. Once, during a hospital vigil in the spring of 2029, a teenager held it and asked, "What's this for?" We explained, 2 minutes of silliness before the serious business of being together, and the boy took it seriously, as if rituals were also tools to steady hands. People occasionally ask if boarding that plane in December 2024 was the moment that changed everything. It was not a single pivot, it was one decision among many that taught me to treat absence as an instrument as much as presence. The plane offered me the permission to test the hypothesis that reliable care could be decoupled from my constant availability. It revealed gaps and redundancies, some of which we fixed, some of which remained stubbornly structural. It taught me, cruelly and kindly, that to be a good kin is less about being omnipresent and more about orchestrating a system that survives your travel. As I schedule the next trip, as I update the spreadsheet with medication times for a future guest nurse, as I add a reminder to call the insurance company 2 weeks before any major holiday, I keep thinking of small, steady things. The hat on its peg, Marta's casseroles thawed and reheated with more respect for microwave times than for culinary purism, Renata's playlists that traveled across time zones on my phone. These are the currencies we use: a dish, a song, a carefully typed calendar entry. They are not glamorous. They are, sometimes, the most honest work we have. In the years to come, I expect to keep buying plane tickets with both reluctance and intention, to keep returning and sometimes to stay away, to keep negotiating with my mother and my brother and the 5 children who thread back in at intervals. The table will continue to be a site of practice, for admitting mistakes, for arguing over the passing of a hat, for deciding whether to accept a casserole or a stipend. Politics and policy will shift at a glacial but meaningful pace. Small public investments will come and go. What I cannot promise is that the work will get easier in any simple sense, only that it will continue to require both imagination and the boring technologies, calendars, lists, call notes, that have held us through mundane and monumental changes. I will board a plane again, and perhaps many times, because sometimes leaving is the clearest way I know to ensure that I have something to bring back. By the spring of 2030, the pattern that had begun with my December 2024 plane ticket had calcified into a set of practices that felt both domestic and bureaucratic. Where once I had been the default engine of the family's logistics, I had worked, sometimes haltingly, sometimes with quiet fury, to redistribute that force. The rotating respite care pool we had trialed in 2026 was now a registered cooperative, with bylaws and a modest bank account. The stipends that siblings had started contributing in 2025 had been regularized into a small, pooled fund managed on a shared platform, quarterly contributions, a rotating treasurer, receipts required for any expenditure over $50. We scheduled home health hours through a cooperative portal so that the calendar was visible to everyone with permission. That transparency reduced the late-night texts that used to make me feel as if every crisis was my private emergency. Municipal policy had not moved at the speed of moral clarity, but it had nudged. In the winter budget of 2026, the mayor's office had launched a pilot for flexible home health hours. In the fiscal cycle of 2029, after 2 years of local advocacy, that pilot was expanded. The city's Human Services Department contracted with a non-profit to subsidize weekend respite for caregivers in households with multiple dependents. It was not a sea change, but it was a tide. The intergenerational program that began at the community center in 2027 grew into an accredited internship route for high school students by 2028, and by 2030 the county had added a modest tax incentive for small businesses that allowed employees predictable paid time for caregiving. Those are the kinds of policy shifts that historians later cite as the small laws that, cumulatively, alter how ordinary life is organized. At home, the hat remained a stubborn talisman. We kept the rule, first introduced in January 2025, that the hat circulate only on certain holidays, the holder chosen by lot and granted 2 minutes to perform some small performative claim on attention. In 2031, during a midsummer family reunion, a 9-year-old who had been one of the 5 children in 2024 drew the hat and, with a solemnity that made everyone laugh, declared a new condition: the holder could appoint a song that must play while the hat was worn. Renata, who had become the family's default documentarian, made a short video of the moment and uploaded it to the shared album. The hat's rituals acquired new permutations: digital passing, playlist accompaniment, a hat fund for those moments when the ritual demanded an associated expense, like an unexpected bouquet for someone having a rough day. These adaptations were small, but they were meaningful, ritual bent to reality, not the other way around. Technology, too, became part of the choreography. Telehealth appointments had existed before 2024, but by 2030 they were routine. We set up a sensor system in my mother's kitchen that alerted designated caregivers to unusual movement at night, The vendor was a local startup that had been part of the community center's entrepreneurship accelerator in 2028. The sensors were not perfect. They generated false positives and once ate through a battery during a thunderstorm, but they were another instrument in the ledger. Our spreadsheets now linked to a calendar that pushed reminders about medication timing to the nurse rotation, and if I was boarding a plane, I could, with a few taps, update the roster and tag the respite pool coordinator. These are prosaic changes, but they shrank the distance between intention and effect. My relationship with travel kept its odd moral topology. I still booked flights to be present for births, for funerals, for anniversaries. I still flew away when leaving felt like a necessary conservation of capacity. I found over the years that the conversation with my employer about remote workdays that could be banked and converted to family time shifts was as significant as any chat with a social worker. By 2022, many offices had hybrid policies. That helped. By 2032, after a wave of litigation and state-level policy adjustments regarding caregiver accommodations, more companies offered caregiver leave beyond statutory minima. These workplace shifts did not erase the hard math of money and time, but they made the logistics possible in ways that would have been unimaginable in earlier decades. There were losses along the arc. In late 2033, my mother's mobility declined enough that we had to reconsider the house's layout, thresholds raised, grab bars installed, the very geometry of daily life altered. A contractor from a local trades cooperative surveyed the rooms in January 2034 and quoted a realistic series of modifications. The respite fund absorbed much of the cost, supplemented by a city accessibility grant that required an onerous application. The paperwork again taught me that caregiving is often an administrative burden masquerading as love. Filling those forms was an act of devotion in its own register. Signatures, photocopies, a notarized affidavit to secure the grant. Those small bureaucratic rituals, which I had once thought of as merely tedious, were now consolidated into my identity as kin. Equally as meaningful as serving a casserole or playing a requested playlist. Family tensions never disappeared. My brother, who had been candid about his relief when given a concrete margin to fail in 2025, remained fundamentally kind but sometimes exasperated by the unpredictability that comes with chronic need. We had more honest conversations about equity, who could donate money, who had free time, who could rearrange their career. Sometimes we failed those conversations and later repaired them. Sometimes the 5 children, now adolescents and then teenagers, pushed against the rituals that had bound them as younger kids. The hat's authority waned and waxed. On a high school graduation day in June 2035, the hat was passed and then ignored, set aside in favor of a playlist that the graduate curated. The hat lingered on its peg and then, in a smaller ritual, was photographed and added to the archive. Rituals, like institutions, morph rather than vanish. At the municipal level, the small public investments we had lobbied for were neither stabilizing nor ephemeral. They required ongoing civic engagement. In 2036, when a new budget proposal threatened to scale back the respite subsidy, we convened a group, neighbors, the community center director, 2 teens who had interned in the intergenerational program, to testify at the council meeting. It was a procedural obligation and a moral demonstration, testimony about how a $300 monthly stipend allowed a working parent to attend a graduate school orientation, testimony about how a teenager's paid internship in elder companionship had led to a college application essay about social care. The council majority kept the subsidy but added reporting requirements that required another round of paperwork and an expanded cooperative treasurer role. Civic progress, it turned out, required both advocacy and accounting. In personal terms, the hardest lesson has been about the limits of control. Even with better calendars, better policy, a cooperative caregiver roster, and a house that had been retrofitted for safety, unexpectedness persisted. In February 2037, my mother had a hospitalization for a urinary tract infection that precipitated confusion and a short stay in acute care. The episode felt, for a time, existentially destabilizing. I rerouted a flight midweek, coordinated a medication reconciliation with the hospital pharmacist, and negotiated a temporary increase in home health hours. The social worker, someone I had known since 2019 and who had watched our family become less amateurish in its management, remarked gently that the story of caregiving is always episodic. There are long runs of dull management punctuated by crises, each crisis demanding a reallocation of resources. That observation, delivered with institutional patience, had the ring of truth. By 2038 we had added a modest innovation to the roster, a leave bank created among professional caregivers hired through the cooperative. Staff accrued paid leave hours into a shared pool that could be redeemed for additional weekend coverage in emergencies. It was a labor-friendly policy that reflected conversations about workforce stability in home health, and it had taken shape at a local conference I attended in 2036 on sustaining the caregiving workforce. These policy experiments were, at once, about dignity and utility. They kept some experienced caregivers in the labor pool and reduced churn. For families like ours, the effect was palpable: fewer last-minute cancellations, more consistent relationships between caregivers and the family members they served. As the kids aged, their involvement transformed. One of the 5, now a young adult by 2039, became a paid member of the respite pool for high school graduates who needed work that felt meaningful and flexible. She balanced campus courses with weekend home visits. Another child, who had been 14 in 2029, became the family's unofficial IT support, managing the sensors and the calendar, patching the Wi-Fi when a storm compromised telehealth. Seeing them take on these roles blurred the division between family obligation and work. The younger generation did not always conceive of care as sacrifice so much as a domain in which they could exercise agency, learn job skills, and accumulate social capital. Financial conversations remained blunt. We added a clause in our cooperative charter in 2034. Members could opt into redistribution if their income fell below a certain threshold. Contributions were then recalibrated. The rationale was practical. Care cannot depend only on goodwill. The collective fund paid for increased hours during crises, subsidized home modifications, and provided an emergency travel stipend for relatives like me who needed to board flights at short notice. The fund's existence allowed us to make pragmatic choices: buy a plane ticket, hire a caregiver for a weekend, retrofit a bathroom, without the moral calculus that used to precede every decision. The hat, aging and slightly frayed at the brim, remained a family artifact. In 2040 we conserved it in a small wooden box between holidays, rotating its public appearances. The hat's provenance had been entered into the cooperative ledger as an item of cultural significance, which was a bit funny and a bit true. It served as a mnemonic device for how we had learned to share burdens. In a small essay published in a neighborhood newsletter that year, I wrote about the hat as an object that taught us the grammar of allocation. The editor ran the piece alongside an interview with the coordinator of the respite pool. The hat had become, in our telling, a miniature history. Looking ahead, the project remains unfinishable. There will be more flights, some scheduled, some compelled. There will be policy cycles that demand renewed advocacy, new technologies that ease some transactions and introduce new vulnerabilities, and continuing negotiation with family members whose capacities and priorities shift as careers, marriages, and children enter and sometimes complicate the ledger. I anticipate, with something like a steady dread and a practical optimism, that we will need to reckon with end-of-life planning in ways we have postponed. The conversations about advanced directives and long-term financing are, in their own bureaucratic fashion, the last common ground we will stand on. We have begun them, haltingly, in 2039. A lawyer helped us draft a clearer, durable power of attorney, and the cooperative contributed to a modest pool for legal fees so that no one bore the cost alone. All of this, the spreadsheets and the stipends, the advocacy at City Hall and the playlists, is part of a longer historical rhythm. Care networks that once depended on a single person, often a woman, are being redistributed through policy, technology, and collective action, but those redistributions are partial and contested. My December 2024 flight was not the decisive moment that redrew every boundary. It was one step in a longer sequence of choices about how to allocate presence and absence, attention and respite. The work continues, and I will board other planes, sometimes to arrive, sometimes to leave, always with a list taped to the refrigerator and an updated calendar invite sent to the cooperative, because the only thing several years of practice has taught me is that absence, when managed, can be a form of care, and presence, when organized, can be sustainable enough to make the next departure possible. After that tidy little self-admonition, that absence, when managed, can be a form of care, and presence, when organized, can be sustainable enough to make the next departure possible. The chronology kept insisting itself on the page and in the calendar. The next flight I boarded was ordinary in its purpose and extraordinary in what it revealed about the accumulation of small contingencies into larger histories. In May 2041, I flew to a regional conference in Buffalo to speak on a panel about municipal respite models. The panel convened city managers, caregiver cooperative leaders, and 2 state legislators. It was the kind of convening that, a decade earlier, would have been an afterthought at a public health symposium and which by then had become a locus of policy translation. The cooperative's leave bank was held up as a pragmatic innovation. It had no single origin story. Members described it as the product of years of piloting, a labor study in 2036, and a particular bargaining moment in 2038 when caregivers insisted that any sustainable system must include protections for workers as well as for families. At that meeting I realized how often my own anecdotes, a hat in a wooden box, a cancelled weekend, a midweek flight, had been used as illustrative vignettes in policy briefs. Personal narrative and policy design had braided together, each lending the other legitimacy. That summer, the technological architecture we had once simply accepted as neutral began to assert itself as political. In June 2042, the cooperative adopted a new scheduling platform that used machine learning heuristics to match caregiver availability with family preferences, supported by municipal subsidies that offset onboarding costs. At first the system reduced friction, fewer last-minute cancellations, automatic credential checks, smoother payroll. But by the autumn we encountered a predictable new form of uncertainty. The algorithm had been trained on historical patterns that privileged daytime availability and penalized part-time workers who worked split shifts, disadvantages that fell disproportionately on caregivers with childcare duties themselves. Our cooperative convened an emergency governance meeting in October 2042 to draft an algorithmic fairness addendum, a clause in the cooperative's charter that required transparency about training data, a human override for decisions that affected continuity of care, and a small auditing stipend to check outcomes quarterly. The audit found that the system improved fill rates but undercounted continuity. The cooperative negotiated a software patch and a modest wage adjustment for high continuity assignments. This was how the new levers of efficiency were domesticated, through civic elbow grease, a few legal briefs, and an insistence that dignity be coded as a parameter rather than only as a slogan. By the end of 2042, the children who had once been 5 had accrued enough life experience that our responsibilities to one another often reversed in scope. The young adult who had become paid respite staff in 2039, she was 27 in 2043, moved into a supervisory role. Her small salary increase allowed her to tutor 2 younger teens in the neighborhood's intergenerational program. They received modest stipends that counted toward college expenses. Another, the adolescent turned IT support, had built a sideline installing and maintaining the cooperative sensor arrays for other families. In 2043 he freelanced on weekends and applied for an urban planning program. Watching them earn in domains that had once been invisible labor felt like a moral recompense of sorts. The care that had threaded through their childhoods became, in the market's language, a type of skill. That translation was not inevitable and not unvarnished. Young people still experienced frustration and ambivalence. But the narrative arc from sacrificial duty to earned competency offered a different framing than the one I had inherited from earlier generations. In early 2044, municipal politics again reminded us that policy durability requires constant re-argument. A new mayoral administration proposed a restructuring of social services that consolidated various small subsidies into a larger block grant. The consolidation promised administrative simplicity but risked losing line item protections that had preserved our respite allocation. We circulated testimony, organized a small coalition of neighborhood organizations, and presented empirical vignettes. A single mother who had attended night classes because a $300 stipend paid for weekend respite in 2036. A retired teacher who had taken a temporary part-time job as a companion because the stipend made supplemental income feasible. The coalition succeeded in securing a floor for caregiver stipends in the new budget, but the victory required concessions. The program now required new quarterly reports and outcome metrics. Bureaucracy, once again, had to be embraced as infrastructure rather than merely an obstacle. That year also demanded a different sort of logistics. In August 2044, my mother's confusion became more persistent. Episodes that had been episodic became more frequent. We had the durable power of attorney in place and the end-of-life conversations started 3 years prior, in 2039, but legal documents do not diminish the aching calculus of bedside decisions. I booked flights in shorter increments. The departure and arrival become rituals of emotional calibration. On one trip in late August I found myself carrying, in addition to medical charts, a playlist my mother had requested in 2027, and a small framed photograph of the 5 children at a Halloween party in 2031. The practicalities of hospice transitions, certificates, home health bids, the layering of insurance approvals, again proved that care is equally administrative and intimate. The cooperative, which had begun as a neighborhood experiment and matured into a small regional network, offered structural relief. By September 2044, it had formalized a bereavement protocol for members who were primary caregivers. A 2-week paid leave from cooperative duties, peer counseling offered through our employee assistance program, and an emergency travel fund that covered last-minute flights. These resources, modest though they were, allowed families to make choices about proximity without the ancillary guilt of neglected layers of responsibility. When travel became necessary, I found that the cooperative's emergency fund often settled the decision before regret had time to harden into self-blame. My mother's final hospitalization was in November 2044, and she died there in the early hours of a rain-heavy Wednesday. The death was not sudden. We had been rehearsing the logistics and the language for years. Even so, there were elements of surprise. A medication reaction we had not predicted, a nurse's gentle miscommunication at a shift change that required 3 additional signatures. We held a service in December that mixed secular and familial rites. The hat, which had been conserved in its wooden box since 2040, was brought out and placed on a small table near the casket at my sister's insistence. In an odd way, it seemed more than a theatrical prop. It had become a talisman, a way of narrativizing the choices we had made together. The children, some of whom were 20 and 27, some of whom still had the embarrassment of remembering being small, told stories that were both small and luminous. A casserole dropped at the wrong house in 2028 that led to a neighborly friendship, a 3-day camping trip in 2033 that taught one child how to silence their phone and be present. Grief was processed in both tender and institutional forms. Condolence letters, the filing of a death certificate, the activation of life insurance payments, and a careful, bureaucratic unspooling of accounts. Estate questions surfaced, pragmatic and not remotely tidy. My mother had left a modest portfolio, some retirement accounts, a paid-off house that had been retrofitted in 2034, and a careful binder of instructions she had begun compiling in 2039 with the help of the cooperative's legal pool. The cooperative's endowment, seeded in part by redistributed contributions after the 2034 Charter Amendment, helped cover legal fees for probate so that no single sibling bore the cost. It was a reminder that the structures we had layered around our lives were doing the work they were intended to do, smoothing choices, absorbing costs, reducing the need for moral accounting that often accompanies money. We made a family decision in early 2045 to sell the house to a community land trust. The trust agreed to preserve affordability for families needing accessible housing and to host a small exhibit about the cooperative model in the basement community room. The hat, by then slightly more fragile, was donated to a local archive on long-term loan, catalogued as an object that told both a family story and a history of shared care. There were unexpected civic ripples from the events of 2044 to 2045. The intergenerational programs that had once been supported by small municipal stipends were now being piloted in 3 neighboring cities. The cooperative had become a blueprint for a regional consortium that convened quarterly. In 2046, a multi-city compact negotiated reciprocity of respite subsidies across municipal borders. Someone in our coalition had drafted language that allowed a family temporarily staying with relatives in another city to access a proportionate share of respite funds for a month. The compact was not a national policy and not everyone could access it, but it was evidence of incremental institutional diffusion, local experiments informing regional norms. Technological and labor tensions persisted. In 2046, a prominent home health chain introduced a low-cost robot for certain routine tasks. Lifting aids, medication reminders, and the debate about automation resurfaced. The cooperative held a member assembly in March 2046 to debate procurement policy. We decided to pilot a small number of devices under strict human overwatch conditions and to ensure that adoption did not undercut wages. The argument was both ethical and practical. Automation could relieve repetitive strain and increase safety, but it could also hollow out the relational work that made care meaningful.